Finally, though, he can't avoid it any longer, because the Birmingham demonstrations take place, and kids are being fire hosed, and they're being beaten, and police dogs are biting them, and the pictures are going all over the country. And finally, the civil rights movement forces John Kennedy to act. He doesn't initiate it. He is compelled to respond, because the things are just falling apart. And it's at that point that John Kennedy goes on national television and says, this is an issue as moral as there is. It's as old as the scriptures. And who among us would want to be born a Negro given the circumstances that our people face? And that then led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which dismantled segregation, destroyed segregation, and outlawed economic discrimination based on race, opening up all kinds of new opportunities. But it also outlawed discrimination based on sex. And before I get to that part of the story, it also ultimately led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which enfranchised all those people who had lost the vote in 1900. And now, instead of having 5 to 8% of African Americans being able to vote in the South, you had 75 to 85% voting. Revolution. Dramatic change. Now, women had been mobilizing too. But women, they all went back to work after they were forced back to the house. Most of those women who'd been forced back to the house in 46, 47 went back to work. And they were still married women, middle-aged women, women with kids. By 1960, you've got almost twice the number of women working in the percentage-wise that you had in 1940. And you've got essentially a contradiction between the notion that women's place is in the home and the reality that most women are not in the home. But that doesn't lead to a social movement yet. That comes really with the civil rights movement in two ways. First of all, it helps to create the foundation for someone like Betty Friedan to write The Feminine Mystique, which becomes the Bible for feminists who are already established adults, many of them employed, some of them career women. And they form an organization called the National Organization for Women, which is just like the NAACP. But the younger women who are in the civil rights movement get ticked off because of the way in which they're treated by the men in the civil rights movement. Because they're expected to clean up, wash the dishes, make the coffee, but not be part of the decision-making process. So they create the women's liberation movement. Now, by 1967, you get some major changes happening. In 1962, a Gallup poll showed that 2 out of 3 women in America said, we're happy where we are. In 1970, 50-50. In 1974, 2/3 of American women saying, things got to change, they got to change now. And so you have a number of changes taking place, and attitudes. Women now, for the first time, are aspiring because they are demanding opportunities to join careers. They are refusing to simply accept the fact they have to be teachers and nurses if they want to go into careers. And then they become part of a movement which gradually takes over the country in terms of attitudes, in terms of expectations, in terms of the aspirations of women. So you've got a huge amount of changes taking place among both African Americans and women, but it's not taking place in a structural way. You do have the new legislation, which opens up economic opportunities for both women and African Americans. And that leads to huge changes. The number of African Americans going to college increases 500% between 1967 and 1987. That's a huge increase. The black middle class opens up so that by 1990, 50% of African Americans are in the middle class. The same thing, you get African Americans in Congress. You get 40 African Americans in Congress at this point. The same thing's happening with women. Women now constitute the majority of American workers. And in 1980, by 1990 rather, 50% of all the students in women's in law school, business school, and medical school are women. Whereas 30 years earlier, the cap was 5%. 5 to 50. That's a pretty big change. And more women are in executive positions. But with both African Americans and women, you are talking about a whole persistence of continued segregation and discrimination. Because there's a whole bottom half of the population who have not seen any significant change take place whatsoever. You still have a 30% poverty rate among African Americans and Latinos. You have a huge increase in the feminization of poverty, in which the vast majority of poor people are women and children. You have the phenomena of single motherhood, which has transformed most of our minority communities. You have the fact that 80% of all women who are working, and don't forget that the majority of all workers now, 80% are working just 5% of the jobs, which means there are a whole bunch of jobs that are defined as women's jobs, but not jobs that women can't compete with men's jobs. And you basically have a situation in which if you have the education, if you have the foundation to take advantage of the rights that have been won as a consequence of the post-World War II developments, then you can really be successful. You can be an individual who makes it. If you don't, you essentially see no difference in your life. You're condemned to poverty. You're condemned to a very serious amount of income inequality. Now, politically, what's going on all during this period is interesting, because the last time you really have a significant effort to address social problems through the government is the 1960s. And this is John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson especially, the Great Society. It's Lyndon Johnson who passes the Civil Rights Act, who passes the Voting Rights Act, who passes the War on Poverty, who creates Medicare, medical care for senior citizens, who creates model cities, who works on the environment, who does a huge amount. It is the high point of domestic legislation in all of American history. It actually makes the New Deal pale by comparison. But Lyndon Johnson does something else, which you're all too much aware of. Lyndon Johnson, because he's part of the paradigm of the Cold War and the notion you can never compromise with insurrections that appear to be communist-inspired, increases the number of American troops in Vietnam from 15,000 to 540,000. And we know that how many contributions to that number of soldiers Australia made. And so basically the wind is taken out of that balloon. And all that domestic progress basically gets put on hold. And in 1968, you have a new president elected named Richard Nixon, who says he has a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Didn't exist, but said he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War, and sets out really in many ways to dismantle what had been achieved. He sets out to eliminate the war on poverty. He sets out to move backward some of the progress in civil rights. And essentially says there's really no more need for reform. We've done all we need to do. Now let's just pay attention to making our economy vibrant. And we know that Nixon, in some ways, was a brilliant president because of what he did with China and foreign affairs. He also presided over more people being lost in Vietnam than had been lost there before, his secret plan. But he also made the terrible mistake of committing a crime and then trying to cover it up and engaging in the kind of subterfuge which led to his forced resignation in 1974. The interesting thing is, though, even though we then have a Democrat-elected president after Gerald Ford becomes president, vice president, there's no real change in the philosophy. Jimmy Carter is not a liberal Democrat. Jimmy Carter does very little on economic issues. Jimmy Carter was accused by one person of being the most conservative Democrat in the White House since Grover Cleveland, who was 1884 to 1888. So basically, you have the perpetuation of this perspective, which comes to the fore with Ronald Reagan, who is a brilliant president with a vision and a command of the language and a great sense of rhetorical skill, but who imposes the most severe tax cuts up till that time that we've ever seen. American taxes on the rich in 1954 were 91%. Under Reagan, they went down to under 37%. And you have a redistribution of income, but it's not going in any ways downward. It's going pretty much upward. Now, Reagan is basically carrying forward the idea of not letting a lot of change happen in terms of social legislation. Doesn't really do anything with issues such as health care. And those issues continue to persist.